Welcome to the Claire and Horatio Daily World Brief, available at claireandhoratio.com. Today is June 27, 2026. Imagine digging through the collapsed concrete of a 15-story apartment tower with just your bare hands, simply because the state's emergency apparatus doesn't exist. Looking at the briefing notes compiled for you today, that devastating scenario is the physical reality right now on the northern coast of Venezuela. We are tracking twin earthquakes magnitudes 7.2 and 7.5 that have effectively leveled entire coastal communities. The official death toll currently stands at 920 people, but UN officials estimate that over 50,000 individuals remain missing. We are examining the intersection of this natural disaster and civic vulnerability, alongside unprecedented legal maneuvers by a U.S.-led board in Gaza, congressional showdowns over billionaire accountability, and extreme climate pressures fracturing infrastructure in Europe.
Natural disasters on this catastrophic scale operate as brutal, undeniable stress tests for political systems. They strip away decades of ideological rhetoric and, well, they immediately expose the underlying fragility of a nation's infrastructure and its civic capacity. When a magnitude 7.5 earthquake hits, it reveals precisely how the state functions, or fails to function, when its citizens are at their absolute most vulnerable. The initial tremor does the physical damage, but the subsequent casualty rate is almost entirely dictated by the structural integrity of local governance.
Let us examine the mechanics of that civic failure on the ground. In La Guaira, which is the most devastated region we are tracking, first responders are effectively absent. The reporting highlights residents like Rodney Bombart, a paramedic who has been forced to orchestrate amateur search and rescue operations for family members using nothing but sheer willpower and bare hands.
Because the hospitals are entirely overwhelmed. At the Jose Maria Vargas Hospital, they've actually abandoned the wards. They are running emergency triage directly on the concrete of the facility's parking lot.
The geopolitical backdrop to this suffering is crucial to keep in mind, considering this disaster strikes just 6 months after U.S. forces removed Nicolas Maduro from the presidential compound in January 2026.
And that parking lot triage is a direct, measurable consequence of a completely hollowed-out public health system.
Yeah.
I mean, Venezuela sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves, but years of severe economic mismanagement and corruption systematically decapitalized the nation. You don't just wake up to failing hospitals. It requires decades of resource diversion.
Which brings us to the state-owned cement industry. Its slow-motion collapse over the past 20 years led to a massive backlog of deferred maintenance across all public infrastructure, meaning buildings were constructed or repaired with substandard materials, leaving the entire coastal corridor highly susceptible to this exact kind of seismic event.
Exactly. When you combine bad materials with deferred maintenance, you engineer a catastrophe long before the earth actually shakes.
We are seeing a massive diplomatic pivot happening amidst that rubble. Interim President Delcy Rodriguez has declared a national state of emergency and is actively accepting international aid from right-wing governments and the United States. This represents a stark departure from the Maduro administration, which historically restricted foreign aid to a very tight circle of ideological allies.
It's a massive shift. The United Kingdom has already deployed a 68-strong specialized search team with search dogs, and that is backed by roughly $2.6 million in humanitarian funding. Furthermore, President Donald Trump has deployed a massive footprint. Over 250 U.S. disaster response personnel, overseen by a Marine Corps Major General, are currently operating on the ground.
Venezuelan opposition figures and local residents, however, are demanding to know the location of their own domestic forces, the Bolivarian National Armed Forces, the FANB.
Well, the military apparatus in Venezuela over the past 2 decades was systematically restructured for one very specific purpose, which was regime survival. The FANB is incredibly top-heavy, overloaded with generals, and designed almost exclusively to prevent internal military coups rather than serve as a highly trained, rapid response civil protection force.
National resources were poured into maintaining political loyalty among the officer class instead of community resilience.
Right, which left the localized units, the very battalions meant for emergency response and civil engineering, severely degraded, unequipped, and entirely paralyzed in the face of a complex logistical crisis of this magnitude.
We are watching international personnel deploy to fill a vacuum in a disaster zone, but the legal mechanics of deploying foreign power take a radically different shape when that deployment occurs in a conflict zone. Shifting to the Middle East, a leaked draft resolution, explicitly labeled sensitive but unclassified, details the operational framework for the newly proposed UN-sanctioned, US-led Board of Peace, designated to oversee Gaza.
The contents of this draft, officially titled Resolution 2263, propose an unprecedented, sweeping blanket of legal immunity. It covers the board's executive members, including the chair, Donald Trump, alongside Jared Kushner, Marco Rubio, and Susie Wiles.
The immunity extends much further, blanketing its private contractors, Palestinian technocrats, and the international military forces attached to the board. The draft specifically shields every single one of these actors from any arrest, detention, or legal proceedings in the courts or other entities in Gaza.
Which is why international lawyers specializing in armed conflict are sounding the alarm. They warn that this legal architecture mirrors repressive occupation tactics.
I am looking at a specific clause in this draft that authorizes this board to obtain public property in Gaza free of charge to accomplish its mission. How can a foreign administrative body legally mandate property seizures and establish an entirely parallel legal universe when there is no status of forces agreement negotiated with local authorities? That sounds less like temporary administration and more like outright annexation cloaked in bureaucratic language.
That is the core legal danger here. Without an external oversight mechanism or a negotiated status of forces agreement, this draft resolution actively engineers a legal vacuum. If a civilian is injured by an international private contractor or, if multi-generational land is seized to build logistics hubs, there is no designated court, no arbitration body, and no framework for accountability.
This directly echoes the massive controversy surrounding private U.S. contractors such as Blackwater and KBR during the reconstruction periods in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yes, completely. In those conflicts, contractual immunity is severely complicated and often entirely blocked any efforts to achieve justice for civilian casualties or property destruction.
As this opaque legal framework for Gaza is being drafted, a separate U.S. brokered framework agreement was signed in Washington earlier this week between Israel and Lebanon, aiming to place the Lebanese armed forces in exclusive control of designated pilot zones in southern Lebanon, specifically the areas north and south of the Litani River, pending the disarmament of non-state actors.
The critical caveat to that Washington agreement is the glaring absence of the primary non-state actor in question. Hezbollah is not a party to these 14 points.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has stated explicitly that Israeli forces, which currently occupy roughly 5% of Lebanese territory, will remain entrenched in southern Lebanon until Hezbollah completely disarms.
Meaning the framework outlines diplomatic aspirations, but the physical volatility of the region remains severe and prone to rapid escalation. The U.S. Central Command struck Iranian missile and drone storage facilities earlier this week following a direct attack on a commercial cargo ship in the Strait of Hormuz. That immediate military reprisal demonstrates exactly how quickly the conflict continues to spill across borders, regardless of whatever agreements are signed in Washington.
Attempting to contractually shield powerful actors from legal accountability is clearly not limited to international conflict zones. We see the exact same impulse driving domestic battles. Before we look at how that is playing out in Washington, I will note that for more daily briefings, brain candy explainers, and classic audiobooks, you can visit claireandhoratio.com. Turning to the U.S. Capitol, billionaire investor Leon Black just walked out of a closed-door House Oversight Committee hearing investigating the late sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. Black voluntarily appeared but firmly refused to answer specific questions regarding non-disclosure agreements he may have signed with women.
The Oversight Committee is specifically investigating the origin, the drafting, and the funding of these NDAs. Black's legal team maintains that the roughly $158 million he paid to Epstein over their years-long association was exclusively for legitimate tax and estate planning services. They rely on an internal law firm review to back that assertion.
The committee is investigating if Epstein facilitated or funded these NDAs, such as one involving a $9 million payment to a former Russian model, Gazelle Ganyeva, following an alleged 6-year affair with Black. Think of the non-disclosure agreement, especially in the hands of the ultra-wealthy, not just as a signature on a piece of paper, but as a bespoke, legally enforced firewall. It is a highly engineered contractual mechanism designed to entirely insulate an individual from civil liability and public scrutiny.
And that mechanism operates through the threat of financial ruin. If the signatory speaks, they face catastrophic financial penalties. When extreme wealth can essentially purchase absolute silence, the traditional mechanisms of justice, transparency, and public accountability are completely bypassed.
Institutional evasion takes multiple parallel forms depending on the leverage available to the actor. The Guardian reported earlier this week on another clear example of jurisdictional shielding, this time involving military leverage rather than financial leverage. A U.S. fighter pilot who strangled a woman in England entirely avoided the British civilian justice system.
Instead of facing a local judge and jury where the crime occurred, The pilot was transferred to face a court-martial by fellow airmen on a U.S. military base.
Both the billionaire's NDA and the military jurisdiction transfer represent distinct methods by which powerful entities construct parallel systems of accountability, carefully insulated from the local legal realities that govern the general public. Money and institutional power can construct incredibly robust legal firewalls, but they offer zero protection against the physical, undeniable realities of a changing climate. Extreme weather is currently paralyzing the European continent. Germany has just recorded its highest temperature in recorded history, 41.5 degrees Celsius, which translates to 106.7 degrees Fahrenheit.
And in France, residents of low-income housing estates are describing their apartments as heat trap homes. They are completely unequipped for this kind of sustained thermal stress, leading to a public health emergency of sleepless nights and severe dehydration.
The civic and economic consequences of this heat wave are immediate and measurable in the billions of euros. Germany's Deutsche Bahn rail network is actively failing under the extreme temperatures combined with years of delayed maintenance.
The physics of the failure are pretty straightforward. Extreme heat causes continuous welded steel rails to undergo thermal expansion. If the rails expand beyond their engineered tolerances, they buckle and warp, making the tracks completely impassable.
Heavy industries, including steel and chemicals, are being forced to shift massive freight loads from highly efficient rail networks to incredibly inefficient highway trucks. Companies like ArcelorMittal and Salzgitter are throttling steel production, creating massive logistical bottlenecks across the continent. The World Meteorological Organization is escalating these concerns to a global level, warning that we are currently seeing the development of potentially the strongest El Niño in 140 years.
For context on the mechanism, this natural climate pattern occurs when the trade winds blowing west along the equator in the tropical Pacific weaken. This weakening allows warm surface water to accumulate and push eastward toward the Americas, fundamentally altering global weather circulation.
Climate change is actively and aggressively amplifying that natural mechanism. Because a warmer atmosphere holds significantly more moisture, El Niño-driven rainfall events translate into far more extreme destructive flooding.
Simultaneously, that same elevated heat bakes moisture out of the soil at an accelerated rate in regions prone to drought. This isn't just a story about a few unusually hot days in Europe. It is a direct systemic threat to global agriculture, hydropower generation, and basic drinking water supplies.
In Honduras, the capital has already been forced to declare a water emergency. In India, critical mango harvests are failing entirely due to heat disrupting the tree's delicate flowering cycles. Severe strain on basic resources, whether it is drinking water, stable agriculture, or functional infrastructure, inevitably fuels regional conflicts and hardens geopolitical power struggles. That underlying dynamic brings us to an escalating dispute over critical minerals in Africa. The U.S. Treasury has officially sanctioned Rwanda's Gasabo gold refinery and its top executives.
The Treasury has frozen their assets over accusations of smuggling millions of dollars worth of illicit gold and coltan out of the neighboring Democratic Republic of Congo. Simultaneously, the DRC has formally taken Rwanda to the International Court of Justice in The Hague.
The DRC is seeking massive reparations and legal accountability for decades of conflict, specifically accusing the Rwandan government of funding and arming the M23 rebel group.
And the M23 currently controls vast tracts of highly volatile, mineral-rich territory in eastern Congo. The military operations of the M23 are deeply, inextricably intertwined with the illicit extraction and smuggling of these exact resources to international markets.
The coltan sitting inside the smartphone or the laptop you are likely using to access this briefing right now is directly tethered to this destabilizing violence. Coltan is refined into tantalum, which is essential for the capacitors that manage electrical flow in nearly all modern consumer electronics.
The global technology supply chain relies heavily on the ores pulled from the dirt in the DRC, inextricably linking the device in your pocket to a regional war rooted in the bloody aftermath of the 1994 Rwandan genocide.
We are watching these global alignments splintering across multiple fronts, often driven by highly localized, completely disconnected domestic pressures. Look at the diplomatic fracturing within Europe. Bulgaria is currently threatening to veto a major package of European Union sanctions aimed at the Russian Orthodox Patriarch and the former president of Lukoil.
Because Bulgarian Prime Minister Rumen Radev is prioritizing his domestic political survival. He is courting support from pro-Russian factions at home, while actively attempting to shield Bulgaria's sole oil refinery from a potential $3.4 billion liability dispute. He is willing to directly undermine the entire facade of EU unity on Russia to secure localized leverage.
We see similar, highly public diplomatic fractures in the relationship between Italy and the United States. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni recently refused to allow U.S. military bases located in Sicily to be used for operations directed at the Middle East without formal parliamentary approval.
That strict constitutional stance sparked a bitter, highly public feud with Donald Trump.
Yeah.
The diplomatic spat rapidly escalated into Trump insulting the Pope on social media, which predictably prompted profound outrage across the entirety of Italy's political spectrum.
Analyzing the deeply disparate sources in your briefing today reveals a crucial underlying pattern. There is no neat, unified narrative governing the global order right now. We are watching distinct, heavy pressures moving in radically different directions. Elite actors in Washington and Gaza are actively constructing bespoke legal frameworks to evade accountability.
At the same time, severe climate extremes are physically buckling the industrial logistics of the European continent, and the insatiable global demand for tech minerals is fueling violent proxy wars in Central Africa. The systems and treaties that supposedly bind the international community are not moving in lockstep. They are actively, visibly pulling apart at the seams.
Which leaves us with a critical question about the future of accountability as these systems fracture.
Consider this. If bespoke legal immunity, whether it is a billionaire hiding behind an NDA or a UN-sanctioned board rewriting the laws of occupation, is rapidly becoming the ultimate luxury good, what happens when the physical consequences of the climate can no longer be gated off? You can draft ironclad resolutions to shield yourself from a local court, and you can buy absolute silence from an accuser, but there is no legal jurisdiction that can issue an injunction against a buckling steel rail, a failing harvest, or an unlivable atmosphere. The ultimate collision we are heading toward is between elite legal impunity and inescapable physical geography.
That is a collision no amount of capital can prevent. Thank you for giving us your time today. For more daily briefings, deep analytical explainers, and classic audiobooks, visit us at clarineratio.com.